Good morning, everyone. This is Joe Baker here with the Edit Bay. I recently shared my first impressions of DJI's Phantom 3 professional camera. My favorite feature in regard to still images is its ability to record Adobe DNG Raw files. There are several things to keep in mind when working with these raw files from the Phantom 3. Let's take a look. If you're new to photography or a little apprehensive about diving into the RAW workflow, let me go ahead and explain the basic idea. When you share an image online by print or by email, that image has certain parameters that are applied to it. Parameters such as contrast, saturation, sharpness, white balance, and so on. The difference between shooting JPEG or RAW files has to do with when those parameters are applied and by whom. When you snap a JPEG with your phone or with your Phantom, the image is processed in camera. When you snap a RAW file on your Phantom, that processing doesn't take place in camera. It's delayed. A RAW file is the digital equivalent of a film negative, and processing a RAW file is the modern-day equivalent of having your film developed. So the advantage of shooting RAW is that since the processing doesn't take place in camera, mistakes can be made while you're shooting. Your white balance can be completely off. Your shadows can be slightly crushed. Your highlights can be slightly overexposed. And most importantly, you'll be able to better address some of the Phantom's shortcomings. This processing, of course, will be executed by you using any software that can process RAW images. The big players in the game are Adobe's Photoshop Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw. I use Camera Raw, which functions as a plugin that's available through Photoshop, Premiere Pro, and After Effects. This is Adobe Bridge, which basically works like Windows Explorer or Finder, but with much wider support for the various file types out there. You may have noticed that if you navigate to a RAW file, check this out. None of these files are visible. You're not going to get thumbnail previews with your 4K video files or your RAW files. And that's pretty annoying. When you're trying to find files, it's much easier to see what you're doing. So Bridge will allow you to see everything that you're doing. It'll give you a preview for any video file that you bring in and any RAW file that you bring in. Once I find an image I like, I simply right-click on it and go to Open in Camera Raw. And this will launch the not so attractive but very powerful user interface of Adobe Camera Raw. And it's here that we'll be applying all of the parameters that would have been baked into our image if we had shot in JPEG. So check this out. If you come up here to the white balance, you can select from any one of the presets that's built into the camera. So I can set this to daylight, give it a warmer look, set it to cloudy, give it a warmer look. If this is, if I set this to fluorescent, it's going to give it a blue color cast. But I think as shot is going to do, well, that might be a little bit too warm. Let's go to auto on that one. I think we're okay with auto. Let's go to as shot. That looks pretty good. Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom are set up to follow this top to bottom workflow. Like here, you kind of start with the temperature, set that to your taste, move down, mess with exposure, contrast, highlight, shadows, and so on. But let's go ahead and consider some of the things to pay attention to when editing RAW stills from the Phantom specifically. As I'm sure you've noticed, images from the Phantom 3 are noisy, even at ISO 100. That's because the Phantom's camera has a really small image sensor. And since it's a good idea to expose for the brightest parts of your image, the sky, when you lift your shadows, you'll notice the noise becomes more apparent. So denoising the image should be part of your pipeline. I usually set the slider over here to about 30 or 40, and that usually will get rid of a lot of that noise without smearing up your image too much. Denoisers work by slightly blurring the image. So if the slider adds some softness to an already soft image, don't worry, we're going to address that in just a second. Another thing that we can address in post with these raw images is the fact that the Phantom 3 uses a fixed aperture lens, f2.8, and that does make the image look a bit on the soft side. So we can fake a couple of things over here in Photoshop, and I like to use a third-party plugin called Clarity by Topaz Labs. So what we'll do is we'll duplicate our background layer by hitting Control-J, and we're going to come up here to Filter, Topaz Labs, Topaz Clarity. And this is going to go ahead and launch a separate UI for Clarity. So we're going to play with some of these controls over here, and I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on this. I just want to, again, share some of the basic principles of how to process the Phantom's images in post. So this micro contrast slider over here, if I boost this up a bit, what it'll do is it'll add some contrast, which kind of has a sharpening effect to anything that's really, really close together. So you can see what this is doing to the rocks over here, bringing out a lot of the detail. You can see what it's doing to the grass. And that's a little crazy. I'm going to reduce that a bit. I don't want to go too nuts here. Really subtle adjustments in this plugin go a really long way, and it's a reasonably priced plugin too, I might add. Everything that Topaz creates also functions as a standalone app too, so I'm using this as a plugin accessible through Photoshop right now, but I believe it's also available as a standalone app. So what I'm doing now is I'm boosting the contrast, just playing around with the looks a little bit to see what this is going to do to the image. So I usually crank these up a little bit and then back them off into a point where I think it looks good. So that, let me reduce a bit more. Topaz is really cool. It's actually got some nice masking abilities in here too. So if we like what it's doing to the rocks over here, but not a huge fan of what it's doing to the sky, we can always mask that out. Let's bring that down a little bit more. Now I'm going to crank up the high contrast and see what that does. Yeah, so that's making the clouds look kind of crazy. Let's go ahead and bring that down. Actually, reducing that to a negative value, I think, is going to serve us pretty well. So if we hold down the space bar in Topaz, it'll toggle the entire plugin on and off so you can get a feel for what it's doing to your image here. Now it's crushing my blacks. I don't know if you can notice this area over here. I'm starting to lose a little bit of detail in the blacks over there, which isn't a huge deal. But if I come down here, HSL filters, excuse me, no, the black levels are right here. I can actually boost up the black levels just a little bit. Try to bring back some of that detail. Over here in your preview monitor, you've got a histogram you can take a look at, and I've got a fairly even spread right here. I'm not clipping, I don't have a whole lot in this image that's pure black, and I definitely don't have anything that's pure white, so I can actually boost this a little bit if I want to. Okay, I think we're in pretty good shape with that, so I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Another awesome advantage of shooting RAW on the Phantom, or any other camera that shoots RAW for that matter, is the fact that you can make local adjustments. And what I mean by that is when you shoot an image with your phone or anything that uses JPEG compression, all of the parameters like contrast and saturation and so on are applied globally, meaning they're applied to every single pixel in the image as a whole. Whereas we're shooting with RAW and we're in control of applying those parameters, we can paint them on to only certain parts of the image, which is a huge advantage. So I like this image. I really like this area of Utah. It's just very layered. You know, we've got the grass in the foreground, we've got this rocks kind of in the middle of the image, and the mountains just changing colors the further back in Z space they go. It's pretty cool. But if I had to say that there's a focal point to this image, it's more than likely the red rocks that are kind of in the middle right here. So I think what I'm going to do is decrease the intensity of Topaz clarity to the grass, and just to put a little bit more focus on these rocks over here. So I can add a layer mask right here, and I'm just going to go ahead and select my brush, and I'm going to set my foreground color to black. So what I'm doing is I'm going to be painting on some transparency to my, let me go ahead and rename this, to my clarity layer right here, just so we can take some of the crazy detail out of the grass so that the viewer's eyes naturally go more to these rocks over here. I know this is not really a Photoshop tutorial. Again, I'm just talking about the basic concepts here of working with the raw files from the Phantom 3. And basically what we're doing right here is talking about how we can paint on certain effects as opposed to having them applied globally with a JPEG image. All right, one of the last things we're going to want to do to a raw file from the Phantom is sharpen it. So I've created a new stamp visible layer here, which you can do by hitting Control, Alt, Shift, and E. I'm going to go up here to Filter, Other, High Pass. And depending on the kind of detail that you have in your image, I usually set this to about between 9, 10, somewhere around in there. I'm going to hit OK. Come over here to the blend mode selection. I'm going to hit either overlay or soft light. I usually go with soft light. And I'm just going to toggle this layer on and off so you guys can see the difference behind what this is doing. Kind of look at the details over here in the rocks and see how those get boosted when I sharpen the image. Now, there's a negative effect to this too. If you can see what's going on with the clouds up here. They look fairly natural up here, pretty fluffy, but the second that sharpening is on them, those edges get really, really sharp. So again, an advantage of shooting RAW is we don't have to have this applied to our entire image. I can come down here, hit my layer mask, make sure it's selected, I'm going to be painting with black, and what that's going to do is I'm basically painting on transparency. So anywhere I paint right now is going to remove some of this sharpening that's in the image. So I'm going to remove it from the sky. As things fall back in Z-space, they get less and less sharp, and so I don't really need this on my sky. I probably don't need it on these mountains back here. I really want it on the focal point of my image, which is these red rocks. So again, we'll toggle this layer on and off. I'll maybe just reduce this a hair on the foreground as well. All right, that looks pretty good. I did skip over a pretty important step, which is dodging and burning. And a quick way to do that is to come over here to your adjustment layers, add a curves adjustment layer. And I'm just going to reduce the exposure right here. Go ahead and close this, select the layer mask, hit Control I to invert it, and then select a brush, hit X over here to set my foreground color to white. And what I'm doing right now is painting in some dark areas to areas that should be a little bit darker. And I can go a little crazy with this because I can always reduce it later if need be. And what this will do is just make the image a little bit punchier and bring out some of the details, because again, it's just adding more contrast, which tends to make for a little bit more dramatic image. And with this skies, this picture actually lends itself to some dodging pretty nicely with these clouds. Go ahead and darken these up a little bit. Now I can add another adjustment layer of curves, this time boosting my exposure. Again, selecting the mask, hitting Control I to invert the mask. And now anywhere I paint is going to get brighter. So I'm going to look for parts of the images that are already bright and brighten those up a little bit. Okay, now I can actually select both of these layers right here, hit Control G, that'll group them together, and that can toggle off both of those effects, and just you can see what that's doing to the sky. Again, that's a really crude example of that, but it is an important step, and I usually do it in my landscape photographs. Alright, so a quick recap. To process raw images from the Phantom 3, I search for my image using Adobe Bridge. I send it to Adobe Camera Raw, I adjust temperature, white balance, exposure, and so on. I then send the image to Photoshop where I can apply Topaz Clarity to boost contrast. Usually make any local adjustments that need to be made. I finish up with sharpening the image. Dodging and burning is another advanced but important step I usually apply to my images as well. Alright folks, that's it for this quick tutorial. If you have any questions regarding the processing of raw images, especially raw images from the Phantom 3, go ahead and leave your comments in the box below. Don't forget to subscribe to the Edit Bay to stay up to date on the latest tips and tricks for post-processing video and photography. Once again, this is Joe Baker with the Edit Bay. I'll see you next time.